Guys, welcome to the J. Scott Outdoors podcast. I want to thank you guys for all the support. I had a record month in October, number of downloads, and that is just attributed to each and every one of you's loyal listening patterns, and I really appreciate that. I also want to thank the sponsors of this podcast, GoHunt.com Insider. They are the title sponsor of this podcast. Coues Ultralight Hunting, Phone Scope, and the Outdoorsmans. Those four sponsors have been the cornerstone sponsors of this podcast, and I just want to thank them for their support and thank you guys for supporting them. I hear from the sponsors almost every day, every week on the amount of support that you guys show them, and I appreciate that. If you guys have any questions of me or comments or anything that you want to let me know, you can send me an email at jscottoutdoors@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Instagram at jscottoutdoors. And send me a direct message through Instagram. I love hearing from all of you, answering, sometimes 30 to 50 questions a week, and getting that information out to you guys is paramount to me. And I just appreciate all of your support. It's the least I can do and help each and every one of you, and that's what we're trying to do here in this podcast is bring information, bring education, bring awareness, and bring a little passion along the way. So thanks for the support. Let's get right to this episode with Eric Forrest.
Welcome to the J. Scott Outdoors podcast. Today we have Eric Forrest out of Tucson, Arizona. And I must say he is an Arizona Wildcat. So I think we've really been scraping the bottom of the barrel here to finally get Eric back on and get another Wildcat on the podcast. What do you have to say for yourself?
I don't know about that.
I sure know how to make friends in southern Arizona, don't I?
Yeah.
You guys are 6-2 this year, and we're 4-4, and I think everybody in the world's beat us, but you guys are actually looking pretty good.
Yeah, it's been a pretty good season so far. I've been watching plenty of the games. It's been nice to see us win this year.
Yeah. Have you been able to get out and go to any of the games, or?
Yeah. I've seen a few games so far, and they've been each game I've gone to, they've won. So it's been a good one.
Man, they ought to put you 50-yard line if they've won every time you've gone.
Yeah, right. Good luck charm.
The big game's coming up November 25th, and I always say, like I think I said on the last podcast with you, I don't care if ASU loses every single game every year. As long as we beat the U of A, that's all I care about.
Yeah, that's what my girlfriend says all the time, too, because she goes to ASU. So I got to deal with it there, too.
Oh, man, you get it on both sides then. So she's a Sun Devil and you're a Wildcat? That's a crazy mix.
Yeah, unfortunately, she's a Sun Devil, or Scum Devil, as we all call them.
You know what they say about the people that go to U of A, right?
What is that?
They tried to get in ASU, but we rejected them, so they go to U of A.
Nah. I'll believe that.
Oh, buddy, it's good to have you on the podcast. I've been following you on Instagram, and I got great feedback from the last time you were on the podcast. We were talking about deer and Coues deer specifically, and some of the historic deer and such that you've been following, and you run a bunch of cameras and really enjoy getting out there, and I just like following you on Instagram. And I noticed that your buddy Tristan, looks like his girlfriend maybe had a tag, and you guys kind of followed a buck. Talk a little bit about that hunt, and I'll kind of pick away at some questions here and there. Tell me the story or the background behind that buck.
So my buddy was helping me during the archery hunt, and we found this group of bucks. It was about 9 bucks in this bachelor herd, and we tried to get in there all August, and the buck she ended up shooting. Actually, the first time we'd gone in there and seen those bucks, I had that buck while I was stalking another buck come just cross a cut right off my side, and I could have shot him with my bow, but he was so far from being grown. And we weren't able to ever get an arrow in these deer because they'd be all together in this group of 9 bucks, and that's 9 pairs of eyes and ears and 9 noses, so it's always hard to get past them, and they'd always end up catching up with does, and so it could be like 15 deer at a time. And fortunately, we weren't able to ever put an arrow in one of those deer, but we kept watching them, and I knew once it would get a little bit later in the year, they weren't going to be in that big bachelor group. And we watched them since the archery hunts, and I did notice they would start to break off in little subgroups, and sometimes there would be like 4 bucks in the bachelor group, and then 2 would be over here, and another 2 over there. And but every time we went out, we saw there was about 4 or 5 shooters in there, and every time we went out and we saw one of those shooters or all of them, it would just depend. So we made it a point to go out there pretty much every weekend and every weekday that we could to go hike in there and glass, and eventually we narrowed it down to a like 50-yard by 50-yard square area that these bucks like to hang out in. It was really weird. It was just a circle of cat claw, and you could put like $100 down each day that if you go in there in the morning or in the evening, when they're feeding, you'll see one of those bucks in that area. And so we had put some time in and watched, and we knew we could count on one of those bucks being in that area. And then there was an even larger, like 300 by 300 yard area where we would find them any part of the day. So they had this little spot. Sometimes one of the bucks wouldn't be there, would go over a ridge, but you could count on one of the 4 or 5 bucks being there.
Okay, a couple questions just to break this down a little bit. So from what I hear you saying, you watch these bucks in the velvet. There was mostly 9 bucks together on any given day. Usually you would find some of the groups. As they broke up, they kind of split off. Now, one question I have, when you say split off, do you mean like a couple 100 yards away from each other, or like a half a mile to a mile? Like, did they really break up, or just kind of not hang exactly together?
That was a good question. They'd break off to where they wouldn't hang necessarily together. Sometimes you'd see a buck, one of the bigger bucks, by himself in the morning feeding, and then he would later group up with 2 smaller bucks, and then when they would feed, sometimes you would see them come together and feed as a bachelor group and then go off their separate ways to bed down. The farthest I ever seen a little group of bucks break off from the bigger group was if they would go over the ridge and bed on the other side. But for the most part, you could count on them sort of kind of feeding together or feeding really close to each other, so not too far away, not like a mile away.
Okay, so feeding together but kind of bedding a little bit away and separate, almost like they got their buddies and, those got those guys over there and we bed over here. And a question I would ask is, why do you feel like in the velvet that they were more centralized and more together? And then why did you feel like when the antlers started, hardening up, did you feel like they were going to, like you almost knew they were going to kind of start pairing up and kind of breaking off? Did that come from experience, or tell me about that?
It's mostly coming from experience. I've always pondered why they do that. I just know from years of looking at them, you never really see those big bachelor groups in that first hunt. Once it starts to cool down and the antlers start to harden, they just tend to kind of break up into smaller groups. Even in areas that don't get barely any hunting pressure, they still do the same thing. So I don't think it's necessarily hunting pressure that's breaking up those groups. I'm actually not sure why they do.
Do you think it's like possibly I'm thinking of just possibly maybe just with the antlers hardening, the hormone, a little bit of hormone change, what have you. I wonder if they're in velvet and, because I've seen big groups of, I don't know that I've seen 9 together, but, say 5 to 9, a big bachelor group. The thing I could think maybe in the velvet is they know there's no competition as far as, they're not sparring. They're not, there's no real, there's still probably a pecking order, but I just wonder if once those antlers harden, almost a little bit of the buck's attitudes and such change a little bit because those antlers actually become hard and, they probably can jab each other. I just wonder if, one question I would have is like when they split off, were they kind of classified in like, kind of a little bit bigger bucks here and a little bit bigger bucks, or was it like a big buck and always a small buck? And wondering if there's any sort of pattern there. It doesn't really matter, but I'm always interested in kind of people's perception of what, does a big giant hang out with just a little dink and that's how they always roll, or typically do, several, 3, like say 100-inch type bucks all hang together. I've kind of seen it where, and I'm curious your take, like where there's a big buck and he's always hanging with like a little 2-point that's like a 2-year-old and it's like his, it's just like his little buddy. Rarely do I see like, 3 or 4, mature, like 100-inch, like all rolling together. Just curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's exactly what is going on in this area. Is they when they split up, they're the only time I'd see the shooters, those 4 or 5 bigger bucks. And what I mean by 4 or 5 shooters, they were like 90 class to 105, 108 type deer. Those were what we were going to consider a shooter on this hunt. And those bucks, the only time they'd ever be together is during the summer when they were feeding together, and then around like leading up to the first hunt, I saw them once or twice feeding kind of together on the same little finger feeding together. But when they would bed and when we saw them on the hunt, they would never once was there 2 big bucks together. It was always one of the mature bucks, and he would have a buck, slightly younger, and then like a spike or a small forky with him. They always had younger bucks with them. And I do think I always kind of thought that it had to tie into hormones why they'll split off, because you see how much bigger their bodies get just from, to September to October. It's crazy the difference in their body size.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of a function of, when they're growing their antlers, they're putting kind of all their energy into their antlers. And once the antlers harden, then all of a sudden all of the protein and all of the stuff that they're eating kind of goes and gets their body ready for the rut coming up. Okay, a question for you. It's awesome to be able to watch kind of a bachelor herd of bucks all summer. From a geographic position, you said you kind of narrowed it down to a 30 by 30, or you might have said 50 by 50, but a small area. I'm always curious, this group, obviously without giving any of your spots away or anything, I'm more wanting to bring info out so people can learn and be able to apply it to their own hunts and what have you. But were they pretty much in the same spot, within how far from where they were all summer to where, when these October hunts started to where they moved? Was it a right there in the exact same ridge, exact same spot, or did they move for a half mile?
It was pretty much on this first hunt. That's why we put her in for this first hunt, because we knew they'd be kind of exhibiting the same patterns that they had during the summer. They're always in that little 50-yard by 50-yard square section. You could count on one of them being there, but the other bucks you could typically find within 300 yards of there. And that was just for those bucks. There was a younger non-typical I posted on Instagram that was super close to on opening day, and that buck, he was kind of the exception to this general rule like we had for all these bucks, because he would be all over the place. Like we would go, a mile to the east and glass him up over there, and then we'd go like a couple miles to the west, and he would be on this random ridge over there. And there was no mistake in this deer, because he had, these crazy non-typical points and everything. So I think there's exceptions to the rule, but generally they're in the same little area, and I think the reason why is because this area we were hunting was sort of like a bowl. So it was it was about like if you were to cut a bowl in half, that's kind of what the ridges look like. So it kind of created this basin for them to feed around and bed on and have shade no matter where they went.
Do you think, too, like a bowl, like you're talking, one reason why deer like little bowls is the fact that that they know there's, eight, if you're a buck, there's 8 other bucks right here kind of in the same bowl plus a few does. And typically in a bowl, anywhere you're at in the bowl, you can kind of hear or see or smell kind of if there's commotion going on. Sometimes I feel like those little half bowls give them a little bit of security because, and I'm curious your input, any place they're at in those bowls, they can kind of know if, the doe's getting chased by a lion or, a hunter's coming up the ridge, or it's kind of a defense mechanism. Any thoughts on that?
I agree with that completely. I think they like it for those security purposes, and I also like bowls too because I can sit and I can glass pretty much everything within the bowl from any given point, on it. So I mean, it's both. I like them, and I think the deer like them. I think it's a really good place to find deer, and that's when I'm doing my e-scouting and whatnot on Google Earth or any kind of maps like Onyx Maps. I look for those bowls, and if I could find a bowl that's like maybe a couple miles to get back to and is away from roads, even better.
Yeah, for sure. I know you like to hike a lot and get back in there and root around for sure. Okay, back to, so the hunt's approaching and you guys are keeping your eyes on these bucks. Kind of describe a little bit, so it'd be kind of early October type of time frame. If you were noticing anything different, were the deer up a lot? Maybe talk about the times when the deer were very active, and then, was there any 1 or 2 days that all of a sudden you went, you knew they were right there, but you didn't see them, and, like what caused that?
They pretty much, activity-wise, they were doing about, we'd only get times to glass early morning and evening. So in those times, in those times, they were pretty much doing the same thing. There was only one time that I went out and I didn't glass up one of the bucks, and I always check the activity charts. I know that it's kind of controversial. Some people say it doesn't work. Some people say it works. But I have a couple apps on my phone that have solar moon phase, and it gives you the activity times, and I'll cross-reference them and see if there's like a certain time that appears on both of them. And then I'll know, hey, like that time's a good activity time. And the time I went out and I didn't see anything, it was at like the lowest activity time for the day. And I figured that was the reason why.
I'm real curious about that. If you wouldn't mind, I don't know if you know those apps off the top of your head, if you wouldn't mind mentioning those apps. And if not, maybe you could text them and I'll link them up or something. But I'm interested in hearing more. So definitely the cellular tables, like you've definitely seen how when it says it's supposed to be peak activity, that you notice that it is. You've found a correlation?
Yeah, I've always. I grew up. My dad, he showed me it back when we would just look at the GPS and see the times, and it usually proved to be pretty consistently accurate. The 2 apps that I choose, I mean, you could search and kind of to your own discretion figure out which apps are good, but the 2 apps that I use are Time to Hunt Light and Fishing and Hunting Solar Lunar, hold on a sec, Solar Lunar Time. And I have an Android, so I don't know if they're available on iPhone as readily available, but that's what I use. And sometimes one will say it's a very poor day, and the other one will say it's an excellent day. So I don't pay much attention to what they rate the day as. More so, I pay attention to what times they say is the major time and what's the minor time. I just look for those peaks of activity.
And did I also hear you say that you also look when those charts actually kind of match up? Because sometimes they won't be the same, but if you find that both charts are saying between this time and this time? Like, do you take special notice to that?
Yeah, I do. Yep. And I know
and
if it's,
you've seen a correlation of if both apps match up, that dang if they're not pretty accurate.
Yeah, you can. Tristan learned that on the hunt. Is we on opening day we had gotten on one of the biggest buck we had seen back there, and unfortunately he'd gotten up when we were trying to change position. But so we were there the whole day and looking during the middle of the day when there's not much activity. And I can't remember what the time was that day. It was kind of an off time. It was like 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock. I think it was 3 o'clock, and that's what the charts were saying was 3 o'clock, and it was hot, and it could be, you could think that the deer aren't going to get up at that time, but we got in the glass and made sure we were looking at that time, and sure as heck, does started getting up feeding, and you'll notice it. And I also do when I look at the trail camera pictures, I'll try to look at that and look at the times the deer are on the camera and then compare them to the times of that day. And there are trends there. So it doesn't work 100% of the time. You might not see much deer when it says you're going to see deer, but for the most part it does work.
There's always exceptions to the rule, for sure. You've piqued my interest there on something. Just to go back, I know you run a lot of trail cameras, and what I'm trying to get at is for those guys that have those October and November and early December Coues deer tags, let's actually start kind of in the summer, in the velvet season. When would you say are the most active times that you see deer on their feet? And then when, kind of in that October, November, and then in December, do you notice any change? Can you talk a little bit about those time frames when you said, if anybody out there listening that's new to Coues deer hunting, you would say in August, you've got to be glassing X, Y, and Z. In October, early November, you've got, these are the peak times that you found. Like, can you go through that?
So you're asking trail camera wise, like the trends I see across the year?
Well, not only trail camera, but what you've witnessed, being able to watch a bachelor group. I think you just said, though, in August you pretty much had to, and even early October, because of your school schedule, you were only glassing morning and evening. But I guess my question is, like, when they're in velvet in August, is there a certain time when you think is just money to be out there glassing? And then does that time frame change as the date gets later and into these October and November dates? In other words, do you notice something on your trail camera and with your own personal observation that, if you had to pick one or another time, when are those times, and do they change throughout the season?
I haven't noticed too much of a change as far as being able to find them during the day in the glass. I do notice that it always seems like in the archery hunts during the summertime, in the mornings they always tend to be out a lot longer in the morning, feeding around and whatnot. And then as you get like later into the year, they always tend to not be up moving right early in the morning, and then they'll tend to bed down. It seems like a lot sooner. I think too, when you get later in the year, it's really cold in the mornings, and the deer tend to seem like they want to stay hunkered down and bed down till that sun comes up. And once that sun comes up, they'll start getting up. That's what I've personally noticed.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would totally agree with you that the colder that it gets, the more apt that you might not see a deer for the first hour. I mean, I know you've been on those mornings, say in late December, January, where it's clear and cold overnight. In Tucson it might be 25, 28 is a low, and just those kind of crisp mornings. And you go out and literally you don't see a deer for at least the first hour, and then all of a sudden at say like 8 o'clock, every deer on the mountain stands up, and it's that we're usually down in Mexico at that time frame, and it's unbelievable sometimes on those cold, crisp mornings. And even during the rut, when you think, oh, those deer will be on their feet, I mean, if it's cold enough I find that those Coues deer, because they're so thin-skinned, they actually stay bedded. And I think that's a tip for guys out there that, if you have these December hunts and maybe even, these early December hunts, if we happen to have a cold snap or something come through, and you've got bucks that you're watching and you glass for the first hour and you don't see them. If it were me, I would stay put. I wouldn't think, oh, they're not here. I would just think they're bedded down. I got to look a little slower. I got to look a little more detail, and they're going to stand up around 8 or 9 o'clock. It's interesting that you say, like, in August that they tend to be mornings are kind of their time, and they stay out pretty late. I think when that velvet is on their, when they're growing their antlers, they're the coolest time of daylight, obviously, is the morning. But then it can get so hot during the day. I've seen them where they really don't get up until right before dark. And literally 10, 15 minutes, 5 minutes right before you can't see anymore. Back to these October and November hunts, Dar and I got a tip a long time ago. This probably goes back like 20 years ago from a guy named Kurt Batty. I think that's how you pronounce his name. I haven't seen him in years, but he used to be with the Arizona Game and Fish Department down there in southern Arizona. And we ran into him in 34A, and we were just really looking for any information we could on Coues deer. And, Kurt, we ran into him and just talking to him, and he said, guys, now, I would really pay attention to glass between 10 and 2 for Coues deer. And he was even saying, sometimes that's my favorite time to glass. And one thing that always stuck with me is he said, for big bucks, my favorite time to glass is between 10 and 2. Well, I think now if I went back and asked him, he'd probably say, well, of course, that prime time hour in the morning and the prime time hour in the evening. But I think what he was trying to say is don't disregard 10 and 2. And I can't tell you since then how many bucks Dar and I have found between 10 and 2. It's amazing how if you just kind of look in those areas where that shade, where those bucks should be, and picture where the shade is at, say, 9 in the morning, and then picture where the shade is at 2 in the afternoon, that's going to create a time frame there where that shade moves. It's moving from the east to the west, and all of a sudden the shade that they've been laying in for a couple hours that they bedded in the morning, all of a sudden their whole body is completely in the sun. Boom, 11, 12, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, they have to get up, they move about 5 feet, and they bed back down. Have you had the same experience during the middle of the day?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you worded it perfect. That around that time frame, that's when they'll get up and change beds and get up and go to water too. That's what I've seen. That's why I always. What was that?
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that's what I always stress to guys is the mornings and the evenings are prime times, and you see a lot of deer in those times. But if you're out, if you got a weekend to hunt, and you didn't see anything, nothing happened in the morning, like I would make sure that your eyes are on the glass during midday, because you look at those areas, like you said, that as the sun goes over, it's going to shift, and those bucks are going to get up to readjust their beds and get back in the shade, and that's when you're going to see them, and then you have all the time in the world to go get on them and wait for them to stand up or shoot them in their beds. That's one thing I always keep in mind when I archery hunt too, because I know if I glass up a buck in the morning, that first bed he's going to sit in, depending on where it's at. It's just kind of like an area you described, and he beds down that first bed. I know he's going to get up and change beds one more time.
I would agree with you 100%. Like, don't trust that first bed. Yes, they're probably not going to be far, but do not trust the first bed that they lay in. They typically will lay there for an hour or two, and then they will get up and adjust almost every single time. And you have to be precise when you're trying to kill these deer, and especially big deer, any Coues deer for that matter. But I mean, big deer especially. Like, don't trust that first bed that they lay in. And that's like we always like to say, if we find a buck we want to shoot, we keep someone watching that buck. And almost always when the hunter or whatever, or me or the hunter or whatever, are stalking to get into position to have a vantage where the buck is bedded, almost always the spotter will come and say, well, the buck got up and he just moved over. Now he's kind of behind the juniper tree. He moved from the ocotillo or whatever. And a lot of times it's not a big move. It's a 5 to 10 yard move. But when you're trying to be precise and setting up to, sniper these deer, especially with a rifle, like everything matters. And if you're focused on one certain tree that he's bedded on, and all of a sudden he's 10, 15 yards to the left, very easily could get up and slip out of there without you knowing, because you don't realize. And I would say never trust those first beds. The midday bed, once they bed down a second time, I would tell you're probably a good 2 or 3 hours that deer is going to be right there.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's go back to the days up before this hunt and kind of tell us kind of how the hunt went down, and did it happen right away? Was it like clockwork, or was it what challenges? Like, go through how it happened.
So Tristan and I put a lot of effort into trying to get out and make sure those bucks were still there. We didn't have much of a history of hunting this area, so we didn't know if they were gonna, when the rifle hunts come, if they're gonna move or what they're gonna do. So we want to just keep eyes on them and make sure that they're still on exhibiting their normal patterns, and that when the hunt comes, we'd be able to get it done. And so I had class till on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I would have class till 4:45, and the sun's going down a lot sooner this part of the year. So I would rush out and practically run to get up to be able to glass these deer. And we had a camera on that little 50-yard by 50-yard area that kind of looked down the finger it was on. And how bad I wanted to check the camera and see what kind of good pictures I got of these bucks, but I didn't want to mess it up. So we made sure we never breached about a 500-yard area of these deer. We were always about 800, 900 yards away looking, and we respected.
Can I stop you right there?
Yeah.
Can I stop you right there? I think that's so important. You have so much experience. I can tell from your dad. You've learned. Tell me why. Tell the listeners why you felt it was so important not to breach that 500-yard gap, and that you always stayed 800 or 900 yards away.
Well, if you kick that buck up, he's going to know you're in there after him. These mature deer they're not dumb. They didn't get that big for a reason, for no reason at all, is what I mean. And especially in our situation, because we had it was a fairly small bowl. We knew if we kept going in there and bumping these deer, that when our hunt came, it wasn't going to be likely that they were going to be in that bowl. They might have went over to a different ridge or been a little bit more reclusive, and we wouldn't have been able to find them as easy as we've been. That's essentially hunting pressure when you keep bumping them like that. So we didn't want to make it more difficult for ourselves to find them.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, good info right there. Okay, keep going with your story.
So we would watch the bucks. We would head out in the evening, and each time we went out, we would see one of the mature bucks. And Tristan and I spent a weekend, because it's a really dry area. We spent a weekend packing in water. And we went out and glassed up Tristan actually glassed up the buck. She ended up feeding on this finger, and we stashed some water away in our tents and stuff that we knew could last up there in a week without the pack rats messing with them too much. And Thursday came, and his girlfriend she's a vet technician, so she has to work till 8 o'clock at night. And so Tristan didn't make it over to my house until around 10. And we headed up there and started hiking around like about 10:30 or so. And we didn't get to camp until about 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning. And we chose it. I normally wouldn't recommend doing a backpacking hunt for someone who's new into hunting, especially a girl that hasn't, hiked a bunch. But for her situation, she wanted to, and because it took her a little bit more time than, say, you or I to go hike a ridge, we thought it would be best to get her up on top of the mountain first thing in the morning. That way, when we do glass a buck, it's all downhill from there, and it's easy walking. She doesn't have to walk, say a mile to go kill a buck. And so it ended up working out good, because woke up at first light and walked 100 yards, and we're glassing, and Tristan glassed up this big 3x we've been watching, and so we're able to hunt pretty much just about 100 yards from camp, and she ended up killing her buck. On Saturday morning, I glassed it up as soon as I could start seeing through my binos, and he was about 800 yards away, and they went to a ridge closer and shot him at 3:35 at about 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning.
Nice.
So
he was one of the good bucks that you'd been watching, and my question is, like, how far from the 50 by 50 core area was he?
About 100 yards, I would say.
That's awesome. And I assume once you shot, you were able to go check your trail camera. Did you have some really cool photos?
Yeah, I put them up on Instagram on my personal page. You can see some of the pictures of some different angles of her buck's rack, and then trail camera pictures of them. So it was pretty cool. It was a nice surprise to check that card after killing them and have new pictures of them.
That's really neat. And just for the listeners out there, it's Eric, ERIC_Forrest, FORREST. There's pictures here of her buck, and it's a neat buck. Does it got a little drop tine, a little kicker?
Yeah, it's got a drop tine off its, I think it's its left side.
That's cool. Do you see many drop tines like that?
No, actually, Tristan and I saw our first drop tine when we were scouting another area in the same unit earlier in the year. Before the archery hunts, we saw this drop tine. That was the first one that I'd ever seen personally, like I'd ever found in my life. And then her buck was the second one we'd seen. But it seems like this year a lot of drop tine bucks have been killed. It's kind of unusual.
Yeah, I wonder what causes that. That's really interesting. Side note here, I think I asked you about this before. What is your deal with snakes, man?
With snakes? What do you mean?
There's pictures of you picking them up, and you're like a snake magnet.
Yeah, I mean, I love some big rattlers. I mean, I don't know how many people like them, but they sure taste tasty on the grill with some mesquite marinade, and they're pretty cool to kill. I usually don't kill rattlesnakes unless they're close to my house or they're big enough to eat. Most of the time I'll just leave them alone. But
nice. I've never tasted rattlesnake. What's it taste like?
Really? Everybody says it tastes like chicken, but it's like a chewier version of chicken, I guess.
Nice. Any difference between like Western Diamondbacks or Mojaves, or do they all taste the same?
They all taste pretty much. I mean, there's not much meat on them to begin with, so it's kind of like, it's almost like chicken jerky when you make them. I mean, there's not a whole lot of meat to pick from. I mean, I think I saw Bear Grylls one time eat into a rattler with all the ribs and all, and just chew it down. But I like to pick the meat out from the ribs, and there's not much to pick, but it all pretty much tastes like chicken.
Gotcha. So Tristan's girlfriend shoots her first buck. You guys are stoked, and you get some pictures, some cool pictures of those deer. Let's talk a little bit about trail camera and trail camera placement. In your opinion, for people out there, like, where would you recommend if they wanted to start running a string of cameras? Is it best to run them over, dirt tanks, springs, salt blocks, mineral blocks? What's the best way to get Coues deer bucks on trail camera?
Water sources for sure. The only problem with water sources, if it's a known spot, is you have to deal with people messing with your camera and stealing it. For water sources, I'd recommend try to mount the camera up high in a box if you can. I know some guys run them on salt. It's just a kind of a weird area with the Arizona Game and Fish law with whether or not you can set salt out on for deer anymore.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah,
I guess I'd forgotten that there was something you can't hunt over it. I didn't know if you could still run cameras and put salt out as long as you don't hunt over that spot.
That's my impression of the law too, and I've heard wardens read the law out to me that way. But then I've also heard the opposite, so it's kind of like you don't really know what to do. But there's also, I found, and just from boots on the ground, I found natural little mineral deposits before and put cameras on those too. That's a good spot. If you find real heavy trails where trails converge, that's where Tris and I have been putting a lot of cameras on intersections of trails this year and have gotten pretty good results. And in those cases, I think salt's tricky because I've noticed in the past we could have a buck on camera on salt, and say it's in this one canyon and you're looking for this buck and you never find him, and you go glass some other random canyon like a mile or two away and you see that buck you had on camera. I think it's kind of misleading with salt because you could think a buck is living in the area and he's actually not. So I think with setting it on trails and water sources are kind of the same as salt, but setting them up on trails for sure, you kind of know that deer is living in that immediate area. Yeah. And don't you? My experience is fairly limited with trail cameras, but with buddies and stuff that I know that run them and such, like deer typically will be on salt or be on mineral a lot when they're in the velvet, but it seems like when they go hard antlered, it almost seems like those bucks just kind of pull off that. Have you seen that before? Yeah, you'll see the does will still hit the salt like all through the winter, but around March when those deer are getting ready to drop, you'll see a lot of deer, a lot of bucks show up on salt, and that's when I would have my cameras out. If you have a salt block or you find a natural mineral spot, I'd set cameras in March because then you can see what kind of hard-horned bucks made it through all the seasons, and then you can see that they're in the area, and then they'll drop through. You're not going to really be able to tell what they are in June, but once July and August hit, you're going to see what bucks what, and the tail end of July and then August they'll hit salt a lot, and then they tend to hit it the first week of September a lot, and then it just tapers off from there.
Right on. Well, buddy, I know you've got class coming up. I want to ask you what you have moving forward, and I know you'll always be out looking for Coues, but kind of what's your focus now after Tristan's girlfriend is harvested? I don't believe you have your own tag. What do you have coming up here?
Tristan has that December 1st through the 10th hunt, so I really want to see him kill about 100-inch plus buck, and just not to bring inches into the question, but I just want to see him kill a real mature old deer that's been around and survived some hunts. A real big buck. That's always cool to get after. So I want to see him shoot one like that. So we're putting in the work now. I've already been out scouting this past week looking, and we're going to head out this weekend and look some more, look for that other drop tine buck, and hopefully get a pair of drop tine bucks this year.
That's pretty neat. It's really fun to kind of target and try and be looking for those older age class bucks, whether they're 100 or 110 or whatever they are. It's just finding those. Like for me, the love for Coues are like when you start getting like over 100. Each one of those bucks has their own different character, and it's like I get where I want them all.
Yeah,
Are you the same way where once they get over 100 and they take on their own character, it's just, man, I love them.
There's just a different a different energy about a mature buck. I mean, it's not like we're going out there and discriminating bucks that don't make 100 inches. If it has that wow factor, that's what we're looking for. And most bucks that are over 100 have that wow factor.
Yeah, for sure. Well, as always, it's awesome having you on the podcast. I love, for a young guy, you've got a lot of experience. Tell the listeners a little bit about your dad and your dad's companies and kind of what he does and a little bit of his experience and such. I'd love to get him on the podcast one of these days too.
Yeah, so my dad he grew up rifle hunting with his dad brought him into it, but my grandpa wasn't. He was the type of hunter that would go out with a pocket knife in his pocket and like a flashlight, and that would be and a rifle, and that would be his hunting attire for the day, and he'd walk around and wait until he just picked up a buck or saw a buck. Definitely wasn't glassing or anything like that. Wasn't archery hunting. So my dad, he grew up hunting like that, and very quickly turned on to bows, and then he wanted to figure out how to become better, and just naturally started acquiring the skills of how to find big deer. And I think the last time he shot a deer with a rifle was, I'd like to say it was in '89, but ever since then he's filled his tag with the archery kill. So he's one of those guys that you don't hear much about, but is like consistently successful in archery. He developed Sonoran bow hunting products, and so he had the Sonoran broadhead, and that ended up getting bought by Swacker. And so I don't know if you guys have heard of Swacker broadheads, but that's his product. And he makes some bow sights too. He used to, he doesn't anymore. That was essentially his company. But now he's retired and he's out scouting and doing everything he wants to. So I'm pretty jealous. Nice. I'm not there yet, but.
Well, it's always nice. I'm sure I can just tell you've learned a ton from him, and it's pretty neat. I know he's. You're right. I mean, not a lot of people know. He's done a lot of stuff and killed a lot of stuff, and he just kind of goes about his business and does his thing, and I really admire him for that. I haven't met him, but I'd love to have him on the podcast here one of these days, because I'm sure we could all learn from his experience. And yeah, that's pretty neat that you've been able to learn all that you have, from him, and you've also been able to learn a bunch of stuff just by being out there too yourself. So it's pretty cool. Buddy, I know you got to get to class. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. I encourage the listeners to check you out on Instagram. I will link it up in the show notes, the podcast notes. And I guess next time I talk to you probably will be after the Sun Devils have whipped up on the Wildcats. You'll be probably just about done on Tristan's hunt. But no, it's always good, fun banter. My cousin went to U of A, and I've got some other friends that Brian Rims that went to U of A, so it's always a fun time of year. Yeah. And it's always fun to have that little rivalry. And so anyway, have a good day, and hope you guys kill another great buck. And thanks for the great posts on Instagram, and keep enjoying what you're doing. And I guess until I talk to you next time, God bless. Okay.
All right. Thank you. It was an honor to be on again. It's always a pleasure.
Well, thanks for sharing with us. All right. You take care.
All right. You too, buddy.
All right. Bye.